We often imagine that those who are highly spiritual have achieved a state of constant peace, enlightenment, and wisdom. But those of us who've walked this path for long enough know that even spiritual people, no matter how far along their journey, can make mistakes. And there's one mistake beyond all others that so many of us fall into, no matter how wise or aware we might think we are. That mistake is subtle, elusive, and often disguised as virtue. It's the mistake of believing we have arrived. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever had a moment in your spiritual journey where you felt like you finally got it? That sudden burst of insight, that moment of clarity where everything seemed to make sense? It's an intoxicating feeling, isn't it? You start to think, this is it. I understand now. I've reached the summit, but here's the paradox. The moment you believe you've reached the pinnacle of spiritual understanding is often the very moment you stop growing.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Why is that? Why does this sense of arrival, this belief that we figured it all out, actually hinder us rather than help us? The truth is, spirituality is not a destination. It's not a place we can arrive at and say, I'm done. I've achieved enlightenment. It's more like an ever-expanding horizon. Every time we think we've reached the end, we realize there's so much more beyond. And yet so many of us fall into the trap of believing that we've reached some final state of understanding. We start to mistake the map for the territory, the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. I've seen this mistake countless times in myself, in others. We gain a little wisdom, a little insight, and suddenly we think we've unlocked the mysteries of the universe. But the universe is infinite. How can we ever claim to have fully understood something so vast, so unknowable? Let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where you thought you knew everything, only to later realize how little you actually understood? That's the danger of spiritual stagnation. We stop questioning. We stop being curious. We stop seeing ourselves as perpetual students and start believing that we've become the masters. And this is where the real damage is done. Because the moment we stop learning, we lose the very essence of spirituality itself. True spirituality is about humility. It's about recognizing that no matter how much we think we know, there's always more to learn. It's about constantly expanding, constantly growing, constantly evolving. And that can only happen if we remain open, if we remain curious, if we remain humble. But how do we avoid this mistake? How do we keep ourselves from falling into the trap of thinking we've arrived? The first step is awareness. We need to be aware of when we're slipping into this mindset. It's subtle, but if we pay attention, we can catch ourselves. It often shows up in the form of certainty. We become certain about our beliefs, certain about our practices, certain about our understanding of the world. But certainty is the enemy of growth. When we're certain, we're no longer open to new possibilities. So what if, instead of seeking certainty, we sought openness? What if, instead of trying to arrive at some final destination, we embraced the journey itself? What if we asked ourselves every day, what can I learn today? What can I discover that I didn't know before? And here's the thing, the more we ask these questions, the more the universe reveals to us. It's like a never-ending spiral. The deeper we go, the more we realize how much more there is to uncover. And that's the beauty of it. There's always more. Now, I want you to pause here and reflect. Have you ever had a moment where you thought you had it all figured out, only to later realize that you were still just scratching the surface? What did that realization feel like? Did it humble you, or did it frustrate you? If we can learn to embrace this humility, this recognition that we are always growing, always evolving, then we can avoid the biggest mistake that highly spiritual people make. We can keep ourselves from becoming complacent, from thinking that we've arrived, because the truth is, we never really arrive. We're always on the journey. Ask yourself, are you still on the journey, or have you convinced yourself that you've reached the destination? Now that we've touched on the concept of spiritual stagnation, let's dive even deeper. What does it really mean to be on a spiritual journey? And why is it that so many of us, even after years of practice, fall into the trap of thinking we've reached the end? You see, the spiritual path is not linear. It's not like climbing a mountain where, once you reach the top, you can sit back and enjoy the view. It's more like an ocean, vast, deep, and full of mysteries that we can spend lifetimes exploring. And yet, so many of us treat it like a checklist. We meditate, we pray, we go on retreats, we read the sacred texts, and then we think, okay, I've done it. I'm enlightened now. But enlightenment, if it can even be called that, is not a one-time event. It's a process. It's something that unfolds over time, often in ways that we don't expect. And the moment we think we've achieved it, we've missed the point. Because true enlightenment is not about achieving anything. It's about being open to everything. Think about it. How many times have you experienced a profound insight, only to later realize that it was just the beginning of a much deeper understanding? How often have you thought you knew something, only to later discover that you didn't know as much as you thought? This is the nature of spiritual growth. It's not about reaching a final destination. It's about constantly expanding, constantly evolving. And that requires us to stay humble, to stay open, to stay curious. But here's the challenge: our minds don't like uncertainty. We crave answers. We want to know. We want to understand. And when we don't have those answers, we feel uneasy, uncomfortable. So we cling to our beliefs, our practices, our understanding of the world, because it gives us a sense of control. But what if we embrace the unknown? What if, instead of seeking certainty, we sought mystery? What if we allowed ourselves to be in a state of not knowing and trusted that the answers would come when we were ready for them? This is the key to avoiding spiritual stagnation. It's about staying in a state of openness, of curiosity, of wonder. It's about recognizing that the journey never ends. and that there's always more to discover. Let me ask you, are you willing to stay in the mystery? Are you willing to let go of your need for certainty and embrace the unknown? As we continue this exploration, there's one more crucial dimension to the mistake many highly spiritual people make: the illusion of perfection. The moment we begin to believe that we are right, that we have discovered some perfect way of being, we fall into a dangerous trap. It's a trap that feeds our ego, even when we think we've transcended it. This desire to be right lies at the core of much of our spiritual stagnation. It's subtle, often masquerading as wisdom or righteousness, but at its heart is the ego's need for control, validation, and superiority. We all know that the ego doesn't just disappear when we embark on a spiritual path. In fact, it can become more cunning. It starts to identify with spiritual achievements, with knowledge, with insights. Instead of boasting about material accomplishments, the ego starts to boast about spiritual progress. Have you ever found yourself thinking, "I meditate more than others. I understand the deeper truths. I'm more awake"? That's ego speaking. It's subtle, but it's there. The illusion of perfection is particularly insidious because it creates a sense of separation. The moment we believe we've reached some superior level of understanding, we begin to see others as less enlightened, less aware, less spiritual. This sense of separation is the very thing that spirituality is supposed to dissolve. And yet, if we're not careful, it can become reinforced through our spiritual practices and beliefs. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever caught yourself feeling superior, even just a little, because of your spiritual insights or practices? If so, what did that feel like? Did it bring you closer to others, or did it create a sense of distance? The truth is, there's no such thing as spiritual perfection. Perfection is an illusion created by the ego to give us a false sense of control and superiority. But here's the paradox: the more we strive for perfection, the further we move from true spiritual growth. Why? Because spirituality is not about perfection, it's about wholeness. And wholeness includes everything: our flaws, our mistakes, our shadows, our humanity. When we chase after perfection, we end up rejecting parts of ourselves. We start to think, if I were truly spiritual, I wouldn't feel anger, I wouldn't feel doubt, I wouldn't make mistakes. But this is a misunderstanding. Being spiritual doesn't mean being perfect. It means being fully human, fully present, fully accepting of all aspects of ourselves. Let me ask you, have you ever felt like you needed to be perfect to be truly spiritual? What would it feel like to let go of that need for perfection and simply accept yourself as you are, flaws and all? When we let go of the illusion of perfection, something beautiful happens. We begin to embrace our humanity. We stop trying to be something we're not, and instead we start to honor our own journey, with all its ups and downs, all its mistakes and triumphs. We stop seeing ourselves as superior or inferior to others, and instead we recognize the shared humanity in all of us. This is where true compassion comes in. When we stop striving for perfection, we become more compassionate toward ourselves and toward others. We realize that everyone is on their own unique journey, and that journey is perfect in its imperfection. We stop judging ourselves and others for not being spiritual enough, and instead we start to see the beauty in the messiness of life. But here's the challenge: letting go of the illusion of perfection requires us to confront our deepest fears and insecurities. It requires us to face the parts of ourselves that we've been avoiding, the parts that we think are unspiritual, the parts that we've been trying to hide. It requires us to embrace our vulnerability, our uncertainty, our humanness. So, how do we do this? How do we let go of the ego's desire for perfection and embrace the wholeness of who we are? The first step is awareness. We need to become aware of when the desire for perfection is showing up in our lives. It often shows up in the form of self-judgment. We judge ourselves for not being good enough, for not meditating enough, for not being as enlightened as we think we should be. But what if, instead of judging ourselves, we simply observe these thoughts with curiosity? What if we ask ourselves, where is this desire for perfection coming from? What am I really afraid of? Often the desire for perfection is rooted in fear of not being good enough, fear of failure, fear of rejection. When we can recognize this, we can begin to let go of the need for perfection and instead focus on the process of growth. We can start to see our spiritual path not as a race to some finish line, but as a lifelong journey of learning, growing, and evolving. The second step is acceptance. We need to learn to accept ourselves as we are, in all our messiness and imperfection. This doesn't mean that we stop striving to be better or that we give up on our spiritual practices. It simply means that we stop judging ourselves for where we are on the journey. We stop comparing ourselves to others and start honoring our own unique path. Ask yourself, what would it feel like to fully accept yourself, just as you are right now? What fears or insecurities come up when you think about letting go of the need for perfection? The final step is surrender. We need to surrender the ego's desire for control, for certainty, for perfection. We need to trust that the universe is guiding us, even when we don't have all the answers. We need to trust that everything is unfolding exactly as it should, even when it feels messy or uncertain. Surrender is not about giving up, it's about letting go of the need to control every aspect of our spiritual journey. It's about recognizing that we are not in charge of the universe, and that's okay. There's a greater intelligence at work, and when we surrender to it, we open ourselves up to profound growth and transformation. But surrender can be scary. It requires us to let go of the ego's need for certainty and control. It requires us to step into the unknown, to trust that the universe has our back, even when we can't see the way forward. So I'll leave you with this question: are you willing to let go of the need for perfection and surrender to the flow of the universe? Are you willing to embrace your humanity in all its messiness and beauty, and trust that you are exactly where you need to be on your spiritual journey?